Mark had always been close to his mother, Margaret. She was a strong and loving woman who had spent her whole life taking care of her family. Even after growing old, she still had that same gentle smile and soft voice that made everyone around her feel loved. But as the years passed, Margaret's health began to weaken. Her legs weren't strong anymore, and she needed a wheelchair to move around. Mark wanted to take care of her at home, but his job required long hours, and he couldn't be there all the time. After many sleepless nights thinking about it, he decided to move her into a nursing home nearby, a place that promised comfort, safety, and professional care. At first, everything seemed fine. The staff was polite, and the rooms were clean and bright. Margaret looked happy enough, and Mark felt relieved that she was in good hands. He visited her every evening after work, bringing her favorite snacks and flowers to brighten her room. But after a few weeks, something strange started happening. One afternoon, when he walked into her room, he found her on the floor beside her wheelchair. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, rushing to lift her up gently. Margaret looked a little embarrassed and said softly, "Oh, I must have slipped out again, dear. I'm fine." Her arm had a small bruise, and Mark didn't like the way she tried to laugh it off. He called one of the nurses, who quickly came in and helped settle Margaret back into her chair. The nurse smiled awkwardly and said, "Don't worry, sir. These things happen sometimes. She probably just leaned too far forward." Mark nodded, but he couldn't shake off the worry in his chest. A few days later, it happened again. This time, Margaret had a scrape on her elbow. The staff gave the same excuse, that older patients often lose balance or slide out of their chairs. But Mark started to notice a pattern. Every few days, his mother had a new mark, a bruise, a scratch, or a sore spot on her hands. He began to ask more questions. "How does she keep falling?" he asked the head nurse one evening. "She's careful, and she doesn't move around much." The nurse looked uncomfortable and said, "Sometimes patients forget to lock the wheels, or they try to reach for something on their own. It's quite common." But Mark knew his mother well. She was careful by nature. Even when she was younger, she never rushed or took risks. Something didn't feel right. One Sunday, he decided to spend the entire afternoon with her. He sat by her side, talking and watching how the staff treated the patients. Everything seemed normal while he was there. The caregivers smiled, checked on people regularly, and spoke politely. But the moment Mark left to get coffee, he caught a glimpse of one caregiver rolling her eyes impatiently when an old man asked for help. It made Mark's stomach twist. He started to wonder if the staff acted nice only when family members were around. When he returned to Margaret's room, she looked unusually quiet. He noticed she was avoiding eye contact, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to adjust the blanket. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked softly. She forced a smile and said, "Yes, dear. I just feel a little tired today." But Mark wasn't convinced. He leaned closer and whispered, "Are you sure everything's all right here?" For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something. Her lips parted slightly, but then she shook her head and said, "I don't want to cause trouble. The nurses work hard." Mark's heart sank. He knew his mother. She was the kind of woman who would stay silent rather than complain, even if she was in pain. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying everything in his mind, the bruises, the excuses, the nervous looks from the staff. A few days later, he received a call from the nursing home. They told him that his mother had fallen again. This time, she had a bump on her head. Mark rushed there immediately, his heart pounding. When he saw her lying in bed with a bandage on her forehead, his worry turned into anger. "How did this happen?" he demanded. One of the attendants replied calmly, "She must have tried to reach for her blanket and slipped out of her wheelchair. We're doing our best to keep her safe." But Mark didn't believe that anymore. He felt something was wrong, something the staff wasn't telling him. Margaret avoided his eyes again, which made him even more suspicious. As he drove home that night, Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with questions. Was someone mistreating her? Were they being rough when he wasn't around? Or was she being ignored when she needed help? He thought about installing a camera in her room, but part of him hesitated. What if he was overreacting? What if it really was just accidents? But deep inside he knew a mother doesn't keep getting hurt over and over by accident. That night, sitting alone in his dark living room, he made up his mind. If no one else would tell him the truth, he would find it himself. He had to know what was really happening to his mother, no matter what it took. Mark couldn't get the image of his mother's bruised arms and tired face out of his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her sitting quietly in that wheelchair, trying to smile through the pain. The thought that she might be suffering while he was away made his chest feel heavy. Something was definitely wrong. But what exactly? He didn't know yet. For the next few days, Mark started paying closer attention. He changed his visiting hours so that no one at the nursing home could predict when he'd show up. Sometimes he arrived early in the morning, other times late in the evening. He wanted to catch a glimpse of what really went on when families weren't around. The first few times, everything looked normal. The nurses greeted him politely, the room smelled clean, and the sound of soft music played in the hallway. But as time passed, Mark started noticing little things, small details that didn't sit right with him. One afternoon, when he walked in earlier than usual, he heard a nurse speaking sharply to someone in another room. "I told you to stay still. Stop making things difficult," she said in an irritated tone. When she noticed Mark standing nearby, she immediately changed her voice and soft, sweet, and caring. "Oh, Mr. Harris, how lovely to see you. Your mother just finished her lunch." The sudden switch made Mark's skin crawl. It was like watching two different people. He forced a polite smile, but deep down, he knew something was off. When he entered his mother's room, Margaret was sitting quietly by the window staring outside. Her hands were folded on her lap and she didn't notice him at first. "Hey, Mom," Mark said softly. She turned to him, her face lighting up with a faint smile. "Oh, Mark, you're early today." He bent down to hug her gently. As he did, he noticed another small bruise near her wrist, fresh and purple. His heart sank. "Mom, how did you get this one?" he asked. Margaret looked at it for a second, then gave a weak laugh. "I must have bumped into something again. These old bones bruise so easily." But her voice trembled slightly, and that tiny shake told Mark everything he needed to know. She was hiding something. "Mom," he said softly, "you can tell me if someone's not treating you well. You know that, right?" She looked down, her eyes watery. "Don't worry about me, dear. Everyone here is just busy. They try their best." Busy. That word hit Mark hard. He had heard the same excuse from every nurse every time. Busy. Too busy to care. Too busy to help. Too busy to see his mother as a person. That night, Mark sat in his car outside the nursing home, watching through the windows. He could see shadows moving inside, nurses walking back and forth, some laughing at the reception desk. But in the corner of his mind, he imagined his mother, alone in her room, struggling to reach for water, maybe calling for help no one came to give. His suspicion grew stronger. The bruises, the silence, the strange behavior of the staff, it all added up. Something dark was happening when families weren't watching. The next morning, Mark decided to ask around. He spoke with another visitor, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, whose wife was also a resident. "Have you ever noticed anything strange here?" Mark asked quietly. The old man sighed and nodded slowly. "My wife's been here for 6 months. She's fallen twice. They always say it's her fault, but she swears someone pushed her chair too hard. I've been thinking about moving her out, but there aren't many options." That was the moment Mark realized it wasn't just his mother. It might be happening to others too. The more he visited, the more his mother seemed withdrawn. She smiled less. She flinched slightly when a certain nurse entered the room. That tiny reaction, that small frightened look, made Mark's stomach twist. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't ignore it either. One evening, as he was leaving, he turned back down the hallway and saw something that froze him. A nurse was pushing his mother's wheelchair toward her room, but she was doing it roughly, with no care or patience. Margaret looked scared, gripping the armrests tightly. When the nurse noticed Mark standing there, she immediately softened her posture and smiled sweetly. "We're just getting her ready for bed," she said. Mark forced a tight smile, but inside his anger boiled. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but he knew that if he caused a scene, they might become even more cruel when he wasn't there. He needed proof. Real proof. That night, as he sat at his desk at home, he replayed every sign in his head. The bruises, the fear in his mother's eyes, the nervous staff, the stories from other families. He realized this wasn't just bad care. This could be abuse. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. His hands were trembling as he whispered to himself, "I have to know the truth." And then an idea came to him, quiet but powerful. If no one would tell him what was really happening, he'd have to find out on his own. He would see it with his own eyes. Mark decided he would install hidden cameras in his mother's room. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only way to uncover the truth once and for all. As he planned everything carefully, where to hide them, when to install them, how to keep it secret, one thought echoed in his mind. If something bad was happening to his mother, he was going to stop it, no matter what it took. Mark didn't sleep that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind running in circles. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's frightened face and those purple bruises that never seemed to heal. He had promised her safety, promised her peace. Yet here she was, trapped in a place that was supposed to protect her. The thought made his heart ache with guilt. By morning, he had made up his mind. He was done waiting for answers. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. And the only way to do that was to set up hidden cameras in her room. But Mark wasn't the kind of man who jumped into things without thinking. He spent the next few days quietly planning. He researched small cameras online, the kind that could blend into everyday objects, alarm clocks, picture frames, even light bulbs. He wanted something that could record clearly without drawing attention. Every decision mattered. If the staff found out, they might hide their behavior, or worse, take it out on his mother. He also had to think about the law. He didn't want to break any rules, but this wasn't about spying. It was about protecting someone he loved. So he made sure to place the cameras in a way that respected her privacy, but still captured what was happening around her wheelchair and bed. The next weekend, Mark arrived at the nursing home with his usual smile and a bag of groceries. Inside that bag, hidden under some fruit and biscuits, were 2 tiny cameras no bigger than buttons. His heart raced as he greeted the staff like always, pretending everything was normal. When he entered his mother's room, Margaret looked up with her tired but loving smile. "Oh, Mark, you didn't have to bring so much food." "You spoil me," she said softly. He smiled back. "You know I can't help it, Mom. You deserve it." As they talked, he began to look around the room carefully. He noticed the small clock on the nightstand, the shelf near her wheelchair, and the curtain rod by the window. All good spots for hidden cameras. When a nurse came in to check Margaret's vitals, Mark smiled politely and said he'd stay a while to clean and rearrange some of her things. Once the nurse left, he quickly got to work. His hands shook slightly as he installed the first camera inside a fake clock and placed it on the nightstand facing her bed. The second one went behind a decorative photo frame on the shelf, aimed toward the wheelchair area. He checked both cameras using an app on his phone. The video was clear and every detail visible. His heart pounded as he whispered, "All right, Mom, let's see what's really going on." Over the next few days, Mark acted normal. He visited as usual, spoke kindly to the staff, and even brought cookies for the nurses, pretending to be his usual friendly self. But inside he was filled with tension. Every night after work, he sat down in his living room, opened his laptop, and watched the footage. The first few hours were uneventful. The nurses came in, checked on Margaret, gave her medicine, and adjusted her blanket. Everything looked normal. Mark began to wonder if he had overreacted, if maybe the falls really were just accidents. But then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. in the recording. The hallway lights were dim. Margaret was sleeping peacefully. Then a nurse entered the room, not the gentle one from earlier, but a different woman. Her expression looked cold and impatient. She roughly adjusted the wheelchair, muttering something under her breath. Then, without warning, she yanked the blanket from Margaret's lap, causing her to flinch awake. Margaret looked frightened and said something softly, though the camera didn't pick up her words. The nurse responded by shoving the wheelchair closer to the bed with a loud metallic sound. Margaret's hand slipped and she nearly fell forward. The nurse didn't even try to help her. Instead, she hissed, "You're always such trouble," and stormed out of the room. Mark froze. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it. He replayed the clip again and again, each time feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and guilt. This wasn't an accident. This was abuse. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." For the next few nights, he kept watching. The same nurse appeared again and again, handling Margaret roughly, ignoring her calls for water, sometimes leaving her for hours without adjusting her position. Once, Mark saw her roll the wheelchair carelessly, causing his mother to slide halfway out of it. That's why she kept falling. It wasn't her fault. It was theirs. Mark's emotions shifted from sadness to fury. Every second of that footage felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to rush there immediately, confront everyone, and take his mother home. But he knew he needed to stay calm. If he acted too soon, the evidence might disappear. He carefully saved all the recordings, labeling and storing them as proof. Then he contacted a lawyer friend for advice, making sure he handled everything legally and safely. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. As he looked at his mother's peaceful face on the video, sleeping softly after another long day, Mark whispered to himself, "Hang in there. Mom, I know the truth now. And I promise, I'll make it right." That night, for the first time in weeks, Mark finally felt a strange mix of pain and relief. The truth hurt. But now that he had it, he could finally protect the person who had spent her whole life protecting him. The next morning, Mark woke up with a heavy heart and tired eyes. He had barely slept after watching the footage. His hands still trembled when he thought about what he had seen. The nurse's cold face, the rough shoves, the fear in his mother's eyes. It didn't feel real. How could someone be so cruel to a woman who could barely lift her arms? He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the small memory card lying in front of him. That tiny piece of plastic held the truth everyone at the nursing home had been trying to hide. Mark poured himself a cup of coffee, but he couldn't drink it. His stomach was twisted in knots. He wanted to rush there, to demand answers, to shout at the people who had hurt his mother, but his lawyer's words echoed in his mind from the night before. "Stay calm. Collect everything. Don't act until you have enough proof." So he waited. Every evening after work, he would open his laptop and go through more recordings. The more he watched, the worse it got. It wasn't just one bad moment, it was a pattern. He saw how the same nurse treated his mother like a burden. She would roll her wheelchair too fast, ignore her when she called for help, and sometimes even leave her in an uncomfortable position for hours. One night, Mark saw something that made his blood run cold. It was around midnight in the video. The hallway lights were dim, and most of the patients were asleep. Margaret was sitting quietly awake, looking toward the door as if waiting for someone. Then the door opened. The same nurse walked in, holding a tray with a cup of water. At first, it seemed normal, but when Margaret reached out with a shaky hand, the nurse pulled the cup away and said something cruel, her lips curling into a sneer. Though the camera had no sound, Mark could see the way she spoke, sharp, angry words that made his mother flinch. The nurse then slammed the cup on the bedside table, spilling some water, and stormed out. Margaret just sat there staring at the floor. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just sat there in silence, her eyes distant and sad. Mark pressed pause. He couldn't breathe. He pushed his chair back and buried his face in his hands. His heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. This was the woman who used to bandage his scraped knees when he was a boy, who stayed up all night when he was sick. And now she was being treated like this. For the next few days, Mark continued to record. He gathered every piece of evidence, every shove, every cruel gesture, every ignored call for help. He even noticed something new. Whenever that particular nurse was on duty, Margaret's mood changed. She became quiet, distant, and nervous, but on days when a different caregiver was assigned, she smiled more and talked freely. It was clear. She was afraid of that nurse. Mark began to understand why she had stayed silent. His mother had always been gentle and kind, the type of person who never wanted to cause trouble. She had probably hoped things would get better, or maybe she thought no one would believe her. The guilt hit him like a wave. For weeks he had trusted the staff's excuses. He had believed their lies. And all that time his mother had been suffering in silence. One evening when Mark visited her, he tried not to show his anger. He didn't want to scare her. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "Better, dear. The new nurse is kinder. She even read me a poem today." Mark smiled, but his eyes watered. He reached for her hand and said quietly, "I'm glad, Mom. You deserve kindness." As he looked at her fragile fingers resting in his palm, he made a silent promise. This was not going to continue. He had the truth now, and soon everyone would see it. That night he organized the videos, putting timestamps and dates on each one. He sent copies to his lawyer and saved backups in case anything happened to the originals. Then he called the nursing home's management and asked to meet with them the next morning. The manager on the phone sounded cheerful, unaware of what was coming. "Of course, Mr. Harris," she said. "Is everything all right with Margaret?" Mark took a deep breath and replied calmly, "Not quite. I think we need to talk in person." The next morning he arrived early with a small black folder in his hand. Inside were still images from the recordings, clear shots of the nurse mishandling his mother. As he walked through the hallway, every step felt heavier. The same nurse passed by him, smiling politely as if nothing had ever happened. Mark clenched his jaw but said nothing. In the meeting room, the manager smiled politely at first. But as Mark placed the photos on the table and said, "This is how your staff treats my mother," her face turned pale. She looked down at the images, speechless. Mark didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was calm but full of pain. "You told me she kept falling out of her wheelchair by accident. You said she was clumsy, but I have proof that your staff is hurting her. Look at her face in these pictures. Does that look like an accident to you?" The manager swallowed hard, flipping through the photos, her hands shaking. She whispered, "Oh my God." For a long moment, no one spoke. The truth was right there, undeniable and cruel. Mark leaned back, his voice low but firm. "I trusted you. I believed this place was safe, but you failed her. And now you're going to make it right." And with that he knew, the hidden cameras had done more than capture a crime. They had given his mother a voice when she had none. For a long time after that meeting, Mark sat alone in his car in the nursing home parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from a mix of anger and heartbreak. The truth was out now, and it was far worse than he had ever imagined. The images, the videos, the bruises, they all told a story that no one wanted to believe, yet no one could deny anymore. He had shown the management everything. At first they had tried to defend their staff, saying things like, "Our nurses are trained professionals, Oshirin, there must be some misunderstanding." But when Mark played the footage, when they saw the nurse shoving Margaret's wheelchair, yelling and treating her roughly, and the room went silent. The manager's face turned pale, and the head nurse covered her mouth in shock. One of the younger nurses even started crying quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that filled every corner of the room, heavy and cold. Mark didn't want their apologies. He didn't want excuses. He wanted change. He looked them straight in the eye and said, "My mother doesn't deserve this. None of your patients do. You say this place is safe, but I've seen the truth. I've seen how you let cruelty hide behind smiles and uniforms." No one replied. After a long pause, the manager finally said, "We will take immediate action. Please, Mr. Harris, we will handle this. I promise you." But Mark wasn't satisfied with promises. He had learned that promises mean nothing without proof. And now he had plenty of that. That night he went home and sent the recordings to the authorities. He didn't care if the nursing home tried to silence him. His mother's safety came first. Within a few days, the police and a state health inspector arrived at the facility. The entire nursing home seemed different after that. Quieter, colder, tense. Whispers spread among the staff. Some avoided eye contact, others looked guilty. Mark could feel the fear in the air every time he walked down the hallway. When the investigators reviewed the footage, they confirmed what Mark already knew. It was abuse. Repeated, deliberate, and heartless. The nurse in question had not only mistreated Margaret, but other patients as well. Small details began to surface. Broken glasses that were never reported, unexplained bruises on other residents, and cries for help that were ignored. Mark's heart broke all over again when he realized his mother wasn't the only victim. The police moved quickly. The abusive nurse was suspended immediately and taken in for questioning. When confronted with the video evidence, she denied it at first, but the truth was too clear to hide. Eventually, she confessed to losing patience with some of the elderly patients. Her voice on the news clip later sounded cold, almost careless, as if what she did was a small mistake. But to Mark, it wasn't small. It was cruelty. It was betrayal. When he visited his mother after the investigation started, Margaret looked confused. "There have been so many visitors lately," she said softly. "Police officers, reporters. Is everything all right?" Mark knelt beside her and held her hand. "Everything's going to be all right now, Mom. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know the full story, but she could feel the weight lifting. She could sense that the dark cloud that had hung over her was finally disappearing. Over the next few weeks, big changes took place. The nursing home fired several staff members who had ignored the abuse. New management was brought in. Security cameras were officially installed in every hallway and common room. Families were invited to visit any time unannounced. It was no longer just a facility. It was becoming a place where people were actually cared for. But even with these improvements, Mark couldn't shake the anger that burned inside him. Every time he saw his mother's healing bruises, he thought of how helpless she must have felt. He had trusted strangers with her care, and they had betrayed that trust. Still, amidst all the anger, there was something else too. Relief. For the first time in months, he could visit his mother without fear. He could sit by her bedside, hold her hand, and know that she was finally safe. One afternoon, as he helped her adjust her blanket, Margaret looked at him and smiled weakly. "You've been worrying too much again," she said softly. Mark laughed gently, shaking his head. "Maybe I have, but it's my job, remember? You took care of me my whole life, now it's my turn." She reached up and patted his cheek, her eyes full of love. "You've always been a good son, Mark. I knew you'd find out what was wrong. I just didn't want to make you worry." Her words hit him deeply. Even when she was the one suffering, she had been trying to protect him. That was the kind of woman she was, and strong, patient, and endlessly kind. As the weeks passed, the news of the abuse spread across town. Families began visiting their loved ones more often. Other nursing homes in the area started reviewing their policies, installing cameras, and retraining staff. What began as one family's heartbreak turned into a movement for accountability. Mark never wanted fame or attention. He only wanted justice for his mother. But in the process, he had helped protect others too. One evening, as the sun set through the window of Margaret's room, painting the walls with a soft golden glow, Mark sat beside her, holding her hand. She looked peaceful again, like the weight of fear had finally left her heart. Mark smiled and whispered, "No more secrets, Mom. No more falling. You're safe now." Margaret smiled back, her eyes glistening. "Safe," she repeated softly. "That's all I ever wanted." And in that quiet, tender moment, Mark realized that the truth, as painful as it had been to uncover, had finally brought them both peace. The day of the confrontation came like a storm that had been building for weeks. The air around the nursing home felt heavy, like everyone inside already knew that something big was about to happen. Mark walked through the glass doors with a calm expression, but inside his heart was pounding hard against his ribs. He wasn't just a son anymore. He was a man carrying the truth. The manager had asked him to come in to discuss the situation further. Mark knew what that really meant. They wanted to save their reputation. But this wasn't about image or business. It was about his mother and all the other elderly people who had trusted this place with their lives. As he stepped into the office, the atmosphere was tense. The manager, Mrs. Grant, sat behind her desk, her usual cheerful smile replaced by a nervous one. The head nurse stood beside her, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. And in the corner, escorted by a security guard, was the woman who had caused it all, the nurse from the videos. Mark's stomach twisted when he saw her. She looked smaller now, weaker, like someone who finally realized the weight of what she'd done. But still, her eyes held no regret. "Mr. Harris," Mrs. Grant began softly, "we appreciate you coming in. We've reviewed all the footage again. The staff member in question has been terminated, and an official report has been sent to the authorities. We are deeply sorry for what happened to your mother. Mark's voice was calm but cold. Sorry doesn't erase what she did. The nurse shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She looked up for a moment, meeting Mark's eyes, then quickly looked away. I didn't mean to hurt her, she muttered under her breath. It was just hard sometimes. They're difficult to take care of. I lost patience. Mark took a slow step closer. His voice didn't rise, it was steady but full of emotion. You lost patience with a woman who can barely lift her arms. You lost patience with someone who smiled at you every morning and thanked you for helping her. Tell me, what kind of person does that? The room went silent. Even Mrs. Grant looked down, unable to meet his gaze. You think it's hard to take care of her? Mark continued, his tone trembling now. Try watching the person who raised you. The person who held your hand through every sickness and every nightmare, being treated like she's nothing. Try watching that and tell me it's hard. The nurse didn't reply. Tears filled her eyes, but Mark didn't feel pity. Not anymore. Mrs. Grant finally spoke, her voice soft and shaky. Mr. Harris, please believe us. This behavior does not reflect our values. We're taking steps to ensure this never happens again. Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He looked around the office, at the faces that had once seemed trustworthy, at the walls decorated with fake motivational quotes like, "Caring is our calling." The words felt hollow now. Do you know what hurts the most? He said quietly. It's not just what she did. It's that no one noticed. No one cared enough to see. My mother fell again and again, and all you gave me were excuses. If I hadn't installed those cameras, you'd still be calling it an accident. Mrs. Grant's eyes filled with tears. You're right, she admitted. We failed her, and we failed you. Mark stood still for a moment, letting those words hang in the air. He could see genuine guilt in her face now, maybe for the first time. But guilt wouldn't change the past. He picked up the folder of printed stills from the video and placed it on the desk. Keep these. Don't hide them. Show them to your staff. Let them remember what happens when people forget that these residents are human beings, not just patients. He turned to leave, but then paused at the door. His voice softened, trembling with emotion. My mother forgave people easily. She probably would have forgiven even this. But I can't. Not yet. He walked out without another word. Outside, the sky was gray, and the wind felt cold against his skin. But somehow Mark felt lighter. For the first time in months, he wasn't doubting or wondering. He had faced the people who failed his mother, and he had spoken the truth. Later that day, he visited Margaret's room. She was sitting by the window, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the autumn leaves fall. When she saw him, her face lit up with that gentle smile that never failed to melt his heart. There's my boy, she said softly. You look tired. Mark knelt beside her, resting his hand on hers. It's been a long day, Mom, but things are changing. You're safe now. She smiled, her eyes shining with quiet wisdom. I knew you'd take care of things. You always do. He leaned his head gently against her hand, closing his eyes. For a moment, the world outside didn't matter. Not the anger, not the investigation, not the pain. All that mattered was that she was still here, still smiling, still his mother. As he sat there, he promised himself one more thing. He wouldn't just stop at getting justice for her. He'd make sure no other family went through the same nightmare. The cameras, the confrontation, it all meant nothing if others kept suffering in silence. That evening, before he left, Margaret looked at him and said softly, You've done enough, Mark, let it rest now. But he just smiled faintly and shook his head. Not yet, Mom. Not until I make sure everyone's safe. And as he walked out of the nursing home that night, the lights flickering softly behind him, he felt a quiet strength inside, and not from anger anymore, but from purpose. He had faced the truth, and now he was ready to change it. Days turned into weeks, but the echoes of that confrontation stayed with Mark. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the look on the nurse's face, the guilt in the manager's eyes, and the quiet strength in his mother's trembling smile. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The case had now become public. Local news channels began to cover the story. Elderly woman abused in nursing home. Hidden camera reveals the truth. The headline spread like wildfire. Soon reporters were outside the nursing home asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Mark hadn't planned for this kind of attention, but deep down, he knew it was necessary. His mother's suffering had to mean something. It had to spark change. When the case went to court, Mark was nervous. He had never been in a courtroom before. The high ceilings, the echo of footsteps, the stern faces, everything felt cold and serious. But he was ready. He had the videos, the photos, the medical reports, and most importantly, he had the truth. The nurse sat on the other side of the courtroom, her hands trembling as the judge read the charges aloud. Neglect and physical abuse of an elderly patient under professional care. Her lawyer tried to argue that it had been stress, that she had too many patients and too little support. But the video didn't lie. When the footage played on the large screen, the courtroom went silent. Every sound, the rough push, the cruel tone, the thud as Margaret's wheelchair tipped, echoed through the room like thunder. Some people turned away. Others stared in disbelief. Mark couldn't look away. He forced himself to watch, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to remember what they were fighting for. When it was his turn to speak, he walked slowly to the stand. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "My mother's name is Margaret Harris," he began. "She's 82 years old. She's gentle, kind, and she's spent her whole life taking care of others. When I placed her in that home, I did it because I thought it would be safe, because I trusted them, but I was wrong." He paused for a moment, his throat tightening. Every fall, every bruise, every tears, it all had a reason. I just didn't see it soon enough. No one deserves to live in fear, not her, not anyone. He looked directly at the nurse, who sat frozen in her seat. "You didn't just hurt my mother. You broke the trust of every family who believed their loved ones were safe with you." When he finished, the room stayed silent. Even the judge looked moved. After days of testimony, the verdict finally came. The nurse was found guilty of elderly abuse and sentenced to time in prison, along with a lifetime ban from working in caregiving facilities. The nursing home faced heavy fines and a state investigation. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like closure. When Mark visited his mother that night, she was sitting by the window again, her favorite place. She had heard about the case on the news, but hadn't said much. When he entered, she smiled gently. "So," she said softly, "it's all over now?" Mark nodded. "Yes, Mom, it's over." She reached out and took his hand. "You did the right thing, Mark. You gave me my voice back." Her words struck something deep inside him. For months he had carried the weight of guilt. Guilt for not seeing it sooner, guilt for trusting the wrong people. But in that moment, her forgiveness felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. He smiled faintly. "I just wanted you to be safe." "I am," she whispered. "Because of you." For a long time, they sat together in silence. The evening sun streamed through the window, wrapping them both in a warm golden glow. Outside, children were laughing in the park nearby, and for once, life felt peaceful again. In the weeks that followed, things began to change, not just for Margaret, but for many others. The story inspired families across the city to check on their elderly loved ones, to ask questions, to demand better care. Other nursing homes began installing cameras, training staff more carefully, and encouraging families to visit more often. Mark even received letters from strangers, sons and daughters who had gone through similar pain, thanking him for having the courage to expose the truth. Some of them said they'd found hope again after hearing his story. One letter stood out to him. It came from a woman named Linda, whose mother had died in another care facility years earlier. It read, "Your mother's story gave mine justice too. Thank you for showing the world what love really looks like." Mark held that letter close to his heart. He realized then that what had started as one family's tragedy had become something bigger, a movement of awareness, compassion, and accountability. Months later, when Margaret was finally well enough to move back home with him, Mark helped her settle into a small, sunny room filled with her favorite things, her old photo albums, her soft blue blanket, and the little clock she'd had since he was a boy. One evening, as they watched a movie together, Margaret turned to him and smiled. "You know, I think your father would be proud of you." Mark chuckled softly. "I hope so." She patted his hand. "You brought light into a dark place, Mark. That's something special." He didn't say anything after that. He just sat there holding her hand, grateful that after everything, the fear, the anger, the heartbreak, she was still here. Still smiling, still strong, and deep inside, he knew this wasn't just justice for her. It was justice for everyone who had ever been silenced, forgotten, or mistreated. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt peace. The truth had hurt, but it had also healed. His mother was safe. The world had listened, and together they had turned pain into purpose.